Hello, and welcome to another episode of Liverpool Stories podcast with me, Dale Roberts. And for me, I think this episode might be the most important episode of the Place Where It All Began series, because this episode is called Becoming the Beatles. This is the episode where I explain how they become the band, the Beatles, from the Quarrymen, a little skiffle band, to the Beatles, the greatest band in the world. So the story of Liverpool and its people dates back to 1207. That's when Liverpool officially gets given its charter. So it gets borough status at that point, and it becomes a town. But the real story of Liverpool doesn't actually begin until the Industrial Revolution. At that point in Liverpool, we start getting an influx of people into our city, an influx of wealth. Realistically, when Liverpool traces back its origins and its history, triangular trade is what makes Liverpool so rich and wealthy. Transatlantic trade in part, but it was mainly the triangular trade. Ships left Liverpool, went to Africa, from Africa to America, and from America back to Liverpool. It made Liverpool one of the wealthiest and most influential cities on earth. And of course, what it meant here in Liverpool is we had a huge influx of people coming here to find employment. Initially, one of the first major population booms in Liverpool is we have a huge influx of people from Wales into the city. And we also have a lot of people from Scotland and the surrounding regions. But Liverpool's real modern history begins in 1845, and it actually doesn't begin in Liverpool. It begins in Ireland. 1.3 million Irish people escaped the Great Famine that was taking place in Ireland, and they left on boats that mainly came into Liverpool. And from Liverpool, they then dispersed all around the world. But here in our city, Liverpool took in about 90,000 Irish families during the Great Famine. This completely changes the population and the landscape of our city. Within 55 years of the Great Famine, quite a significant portion of Liverpool's population was Irish Catholic or Irish Catholic heritage. So going back to the story of this fantastic street in Liverpool called Hope Street, we have on this end of the street our Catholic cathedral. And originally, by the way, this was supposed to be the second largest cathedral on earth. A guy by the name of Edwin Lutyens was brought in. He started designing and building the second largest cathedral on earth. And then World War II happened, and it completely ruined the plans. The price of materials skyrocketed, demand plummeted. And then from that moment on, an ultra-modern cathedral was what was being built in our city. It upset every Catholic in Liverpool, by the way. Ever since, it's always been known affectionately by its nickname Paddy's Wigwam in our city, due to its unusual shape and Irish heritage. But Liverpool was once one of the wealthiest and most influential cities on earth. Now, you then get further on down the line. Slavery is abolished throughout the British Empire. Liverpool still profits from the cotton trade. Liverpool funds and arms the US Civil War. But then we fall into huge periods of economic decline. World War I ruins our city. The Great Depression ruins our city as well. But World War II, not only did it destroy the dreams of having the second largest cathedral in the world here in Liverpool, but it completely changes the landscape of Liverpool forever. In many ways, we're still rebuilding from World War II to this very day. So World War II happens, it changes Liverpool forever. Liverpool loses a huge chunk of its population. Most of the buildings have been ruined in many ways. But during that World War II era, four things happen: John, Paul, George, and Ringo. Now, John would famously grow up to say that he was born during an air raid. He'd actually said in one of his first ever interviews with Bill Harry of the Merseybeat magazine, he said he was born during an air raid. Now, extensive research has been done into it. He wasn't born during an air raid. It seems like he was born either side of an air raid. But where he was born is here, at the old Oxford Street Maternity Hospital here in Liverpool. Now, what would happen is his Aunt Mimi would bring John up. And Mimi probably said to John how she ran through air raids just simply to get to John in those early days. And she probably exaggerates it, which meant that John grew up with the impression that he was born during an air raid. But Liverpool was wrecked. It was ruined. It was blitzed and bombed. And John was a wartime baby. And he was really a product of that as well. In fact, the Beatles in general were a product of it. And certainly the fans were a product of the baby boom generation that came directly from World War II. But at one end of Hope Street, we have our Catholic cathedral. And we also have, near enough opposite it, John Lennon's birthplace. He was born 9th of October 1940. Not long after he was born, his father, Alf, seemingly abandoned the family. He went off to sea as a merchant seaman, and he ended up getting arrested for drunken disorderly while he was overseas. And then he failed to show proper documentation, which meant that he was arrested overseas and he couldn't really get out of it. In the meantime, Julia, John Lennon's mother, she moved on. So while it seemed that Alfred abandoned the family, Julia would almost become the shame of their family because she would have a baby outside of wedlock. You know, in fact, while her husband was nowhere to be seen, it was devastating for the Stanley family, you know. And then Alf came back claiming he'd been locked up overseas for a crime he didn't commit. Julia didn't believe him. She found a new man called Bobby Dykins. But all of this chaos in John Lennon's early life meant that at the age of 5, his Aunt Mimi would start to look after him instead of his mother. Julia never abandoned John, by the way. It was Julia, John's mother, who inspired him to set up Quarrymen. She bought him his first guitar. She taught him how to play it. So the story of the Beatles owes so much to Julia, John's mother. But for John, it seemed that he felt abandoned when he was growing up. He had an incredibly complex upbringing. In fact, his upbringing was nowhere near as working class as he made it out to be. He was brought up in the very posh area of Liverpool called Walton. So John had an incredibly difficult school life. In fact, one of his school reports read that he was destined for failure and that he'd amount to nothing. He was disruptive in class. But after losing his mother and the fact that he wasn't very academic anyway, John Lennon would go to the Liverpool Art College. Where was Liverpool Art College? It's on Hope Street. So again, in the story of the Beatles, you really have the people really being represented in Hope Street. You have John being born at the top end of Hope Street at Oxford Street Maternity Hospital. And then eventually he'd end up in college on Hope Street as well. So John wasn't academic. He was very well educated and he was very well versed. But in terms of academia, John didn't excel in school, as I was saying just then. In fact, his Aunt Mimi really fought with the headmaster to make sure that John could continue with his opportunities, because Mimi, John's Aunt Mimi, didn't ever believe that John's guitar playing would amount to nothing. John was banned from playing the guitar inside his own house. Whenever his Aunt Mimi caught him playing guitar, she'd say, "John, the guitar's all well and good, but you'll never make a living out of it." I think that's one of the greatest quotes in history, because how wrong she was, you know. But with his school report as well, destined for failure, he'll amount to nothing. It really was quite the miracle that John Lennon got accepted into the Liverpool Art College. This is the Liverpool Art College, and John Lennon went here. He would study here. It was here where he meet his best friend and original bass player of the Beatles, Stuart Sutcliffe. And Stuart plays an almighty part in the story of the Beatles. Huge part. But also, this is where he meets his first wife, Cynthia Powell, and this is where he'd start dating her. He'd take her on dates to Hope Street as well. But really, and again, what is probably one of the best moments of chance in the story of the Beatles is that when John goes to the Liverpool Art College, it just so happens that it's right next door to the Liverpool Institute for Boys. This was the high school that Paul McCartney and George Harrison attended. So John, Paul, and George were all educated next door to each other. And in the story of the Beatles, that's a huge chance encounter that happens. It's incredible when you're showing people around on tours of Liverpool that they all were educated next door to each other in essence. But Paul and George would sneak into the Liverpool Art College so they could rehearse and practice with John. There was a little corridor that united the two of them. And in our modern history, you get further down the line, the dark days of the 1980s come to Liverpool. Liverpool falls into periods of economic and social decline. We lose near half of our population, 80% youth unemployment plagues our city. Unfortunately, these two buildings get to the point where they're falling apart, they're dilapidated. Paul McCartney hears us, he's quite upset. So Paul and a few other wealthy investors get together and they end up purchasing these buildings, renovating the buildings, and they set up their own university in Liverpool called LIPA, where Paul is still the main patron to this very day. And ever since 1996, when they first opened it, Paul comes back to LIPA every year to present the graduation ceremonies. And he also does master classes with his students throughout the year as well. So this is a very important location in the history of the Beatles, where John, Paul, and George were educated conveniently next door to each other. But not only that, John Lennon would drink in the area, and more importantly, he would live in this neighborhood on 2 separate occasions off Hope Street. This monument, by the way, is called a case history, and it's supposed to represent Liverpool's lost luggage through time. So you'll find cases of people like Charles Dickens, who spent a lot of time in the city. Over on the other side over there, you'll find the bass case of Stuart Sutcliffe, and there used to be a big bass drum for Ringo over there as well. And there was acorns that John and Yoko had sent around the world. So it's Liverpool's lost luggage through time because, as I say, really, at Liverpool's core, we are a port city, a melting pot of so many different communities and cultures. The oldest Chinese community in the whole of Europe, one of the oldest African communities, one of the oldest Scandinavian communities as well. We're a melting pot of so many different communities and cultures. We're a port city, and that's really what Liverpool's all about. So throughout John Lennon's childhood, he lived in number 251 Menlove Avenue. That was officially his address from the age of 5 until the age of 23, when he becomes that Beatle and he can't live inside the house anymore because fans are screaming outside the door. But the reality of it is, John unofficially lived in a few different locations, and this was one of them, number 3, Gambier Terrace. When John Lennon went to Liverpool Art College and he became friends with Stuart Sutcliffe, he discovered that Stuart had an apartment just around the corner from the art college, so it made sense that John Lennon would move in with him. Now, what I really think is quite magic about the story of the Beatles is John Lennon would study on Hope Street. He would drink on Hope Street in places like the Philharmonic pub and places like Ye Crack as well. But they were in the area socializing, they were in the area mixing together. And not only that, somewhere they came up with the name The Beatles. Now, this could have been thanks to Buddy Holly and the Crickets, but the reality of it is they had to come up with that name in a particular place. Now, when you ask teenage lads to recount their stories from growing up, where did they do such a thing, they're going to struggle to remember. But it seems to be, and this is something that I would say is quite subjective. I wouldn't say this subjectively true, but I think they came up with the name The Beatles somewhere on Hope Street because it was John and Stuart who came up with the name, and they were in art college together. Maybe it was in class. Maybe they went to Ye Crack pub and they had a drink and they came up with the idea there, or maybe, just maybe, it was here where they lived in number 3 Gambier Terrace. John lived here with Stuart, but to complete the story of Hope Street, they also lived directly opposite a cathedral that was under construction. You see, where we started this episode was at the Metropolitan Cathedral of Christ the King, the Catholic cathedral at one end of Hope Street. At the other end of Hope Street, John Lennon lived. At one end, he was born opposite the cathedral. At the other end, he lived with Stuart, and it was directly opposite what is our Protestant cathedral. Some people call it the Anglican Cathedral, but it's officially called the Liverpool Cathedral. It's the largest cathedral in the United Kingdom by volume. It's the 5th largest cathedral of any denomination in the world. It's the longest cathedral in the world when you include its Lady Chapel. It's got the largest, heaviest and highest peal of bells in the world. It's an absolutely beautiful building, but what I think is one of the most beautiful things about Hope Street isn't only that it can lay claim to being the birthplace of the Beatles, but it's got 2 cathedrals at either end of the street, both divided by half a mile of hope. And I think that's a beautiful little message that we send out. Now, for John, he lived on Hope Street. He would study on Hope Street, but he'd also drink on Hope Street. Hope Street is full of fantastic bars, hotels, restaurants, theatres. We have 4 different theatres either on Hope Street or just slightly off Hope Street itself. But in terms of the bars, this one is probably one of the best, not only in Liverpool, but maybe even in the entire country, you know. Great Britain's most ornate pub, it's now fully Grade 1 listed, protected by government to the same standard as both of Liverpool's cathedrals are. It's absolutely beautiful. But it could have been, and it probably was, based on all accounts, an early haunt of the Beatles. This was a place that John Lennon would drink in while he was in the Liverpool Art College. And not only John Lennon, Paul McCartney claims that he'd play here as well. This little pub here is, as I say, absolutely beautiful. So we'll pop in and have a little look at it. So the interesting thing with Beatles history of this place is that when you look back at the history of the Philharmonic pub, it was an exclusive gentleman's club. At one point, it was a snooker hall as well. So years ago, when I first started guiding, there was this quote that I heard of John Lennon saying the price of fame was no longer being able to have a pint in the Phil. And I'll be honest with you, I would say it on tour buses, and then I thought, I need to be deadly accurate. Where did this quote come from? And I couldn't find it anywhere. And so for a little while, I was like, did they drink in here? Did they not? And then Paul McCartney in 2018 came back to the city with James Corden for carpool karaoke. And this was the pub that he decided to visit. And on the drive towards the pub, he says, "Oh, yeah, we used to play in this pub." And that was complete news to me. But if Paul McCartney says that they used to drink here and that they've played here, then I'll trust Paul McCartney on it, you know. Follow me inside. So it's an absolutely beautiful pub. As you can see, the interior is incredible. Two little side rooms, Brahms and Liszt, Cockney rhyme and slang. And a little picture of John Lennon there in the corner. Stained glass inside a pub. I mean, it's a beautiful, beautiful pub. But Paul McCartney came here with James Corden, and it ended up being one of the most watched YouTube videos of 2018. It was a big deal. I was there on the day. I was outside him in the background, waving at Paul as he comes out. But the place looks a little bit different. It was a little bit staged, the carpool karaoke video, but it was in the big back room. So follow me into the main room. For carpool karaoke, this is where they set up the stage, and they had a little bar at the back as well, and all the fans were in here. But as I say, Paul said that they played gigs here. Now, I'd struggle to find an exact date, an exact reference. But this is a pub on Hope Street, and they certainly did hang round here as well. So it's a beautiful pub, certainly worthwhile popping in and visiting when you're in Liverpool. In the March of 1958, Buddy Holly played the Philharmonic Hall here on Hope Street. And if you're not aware of how big of a part Buddy Holly played in the story of the Beatles, their first recording that they ever made as a group, John, Paul, George, Colin Hanton, and John Lowe, was a Buddy Holly song, That'll Be the Day, and then In Spite of All the Danger. But it was also the name of the Beatles. They loved Buddy Holly and the cricket, and they opted for the Beatles thanks to the cricket. They liked that play on words. Played a huge part in the story, but the lads did not attend the concert. When Buddy Holly played here, John, Paul, and George weren't in attendance. Mark Lewisham, the great Beatles historian, says that they were actually in the morgue skiffle cellar that night, so they didn't go to the concert. Buddy Holly did play here on Hope Street. Out of every Beatle pub and club in our city, anywhere that claims to be a great Beatle venue, I think they'll fade in comparison to this one, okay? Because this was John Lennon's local pub, and it's a beautiful, even to this day, it's a beautiful little local pub. And some tragic news really is that in the next few days, we expect it to shut down, and it's going to be refurbed. And most of us, especially those who care about the Beatles history in our city, are just praying that they really, that they keep it as a local pub, a real local boozer, because it's kept its local authentic vibe. It's not overly touristy. It's not gimmicky. It's just a local pub. But John Lennon, he'd drink here. In fact, some people have gone as far as to say he spent more time in Ye Crack than he did in the Liverpool Art College. So he'd take Cynthia on dates here. In fact, there's a beautiful story as well that would later be told by Bill Harry. And by the way, that's such a key part of the story. It's always the people who are the unsung heroes that catch my eye. And Bill Harry was certainly one of them. John Lennon would meet Bill Harry when he was in Liverpool Art College. And Bill Harry would go on to become the founder of the Merseybeat magazine. He would document the entire movement that was taking place in Liverpool. But this is a place where Bill Harry would drink, and John Lennon would drink here, and Stuart Sutcliffe. And there's a great story where one day they went to a poetry reading, and they hated it. They thought it was awful. So they came and had a few drinks in here afterwards, and they decided to put Liverpool on the map. And I believe Bill Harry's told this story, and it's ended up immortalised ever since. You know, John, of course, would put Liverpool on the map well and truly. Stuart Sutcliffe would as well, even though he'd never, ever live to find out how much influence he had on the story. But Bill Harry would set up the Merseybeat. It was what documented the entire story itself. Ye Crack is a beautiful pub, and what I think was the moment where its history really was solid is Sean Lennon, John Lennon's son, came to Liverpool just a few years ago. And on his Instagram story, I knew he was in Liverpool, so we kept an eye on everything he was doing. And on his Instagram story, he posted a picture walking past the Magical Mystery Tour bus. He posted a picture walking down Matthew Street. But this is the place that he went to have a drink. He popped in Ye Crack pub, and there was a beautiful picture of Sean Lennon stood in front of the Don't Buy the Sun, Hillsborough beautiful poster that they had inside the place, and he stood there doing a solidarity fist in front of it. And for me, I think that's it. You know, this was John Lennon's local pub. And as I say, let's hope that they keep it as authentic as possible. It's got to stay a local booze. It can't be too gentrified, and we're hoping so much that it stays as it is. Also, what's great is like a lovely little Liverpool crossover is Liverpool's probably known around the world for two things, which is music and football. And ye crack in its front window, most people never see it. It's got a reference to both. Because this was John Lennon's local pub. You know, there's a beautiful picture of John sat right here with this door behind him, and it says Holden's Beacon Ales. If you're not aware, John Holding was one of the founders of Everton Football Club. So he was the president of Everton Football Club, and then famously there was a split, mainly because of John Holden wanting to increase the rent at Anfield. And because of that split with a guy called George Mahon, Everton and Liverpool Football Club would be founded. And John Holden was the founder of Liverpool Football Club. So here at this pub, you've got John Holden's Beacon Ales. He was a brewer in this city. And it's just a lovely little Beatles and Liverpool FC and Everton FC crossover all in one. It's such a great little pub, it really is. Eventually, the lads would go into a little place called the Jacaranda, and they would be desperate for some gigs. And it was John and Stuart who walked in. And they chatted to the owner, Allan Williams, and Allan Williams started trying to get them some gigs. Now, this isn't one of the places that they got gigs in. They'd end up getting gigs elsewhere. But they would eventually play the Blue Angel. But at first, the big moments in the Blue Angel came when a big London Asian called Larry Pons would come up. And he managed Billy Fury. And he had other artists who had these very, exotic names. And the Beatles auditioned to be Billy Fury's backing band here in the Blue Angel nightclub, and he didn't get the gig, but they did get accepted onto the tour of Scotland that Billy Fury was on. But they backed another musician called Johnny Gentle. So all of a sudden you had Johnny Gentle getting backed by Long John and the Silver Beatles, and they were going through loads of different name changes, but at that point they are coming up with that idea, the Beatles. As I say, possibly thanks to Buddy Holly and the Crickets. Buddy Holly did play Hope Street on 1958. They were huge fans of him. But the Silver Beatles became a concept at that point. Eventually, they dropped the Long John Silver. They'd just become the Silver Beatles. But here at the Blue Angel was initially one of the Allan Williams venues that they would audition in. Little secret here, by the way. I've done tours and passed the Blue Angel so many times, but it was only 2 days ago, 2 days from filming right now, that I finally got to go inside the Blue Angel. I was doing a tour and I got to walk inside. It's actually just a student club these days. On Monday nights, they open up as a student venue. It's not open any other day of the week. But Monday nights, they open it up. I got to go in the other day. Dude, just had the door open, so I walked on in on the tour. But the Blue Angel, the Raz, it's a legendary venue in Liverpool. Okay, so firstly, welcome to the Liverpool Stories podcast. I met you for the first time when you actually, we were running an event. I say you were running an event, St. George's Hall. And before the gig, you sat me down, we were on the steps, St. George's Hall. I was going to be hosting the event. Yeah. And you said, we've just unearthed a new clip of John Lennon speaking, and he mentions the Jacaranda.
That was very cool, wasn't it?
It was honestly unbelievable. So for the first time, I heard this John Lennon clip just as I was walking off stage after introducing the Rock and Roll Circus at St. George's Hall, which was only just 6-7 months ago.
Yeah, it wasn't very long ago.
Not long.
Yeah, what a moment, because I've been involved at the Jacaranda for 15 years now, and I think it's always been something that we've been really interested in, is, one of the four guys talking about the Jacaranda, and there's some bits in the anthology documentary where they talk about the Jacaranda, but we've always known there must have been more, and we found little snippets, and a lot of Allan Williams, the original owner, talking about the Jack, and then all of a sudden on a podcast about a guy called Barry Chang, was John's voice talking about the Jacaranda, and he says some magic words. He says, there was this place in Liverpool called the Jacaranda, and it was the place in Liverpool And all, it was where all the bands were hanging out. And so we were hanging out there too, when it was just me, Paul and George. And he goes actually on for a while about it, but it was an amazing quote.
It was unbelievable. As I say, when I introduced it on the night, because that's the beauty of the Jacaranda right now, we've been speaking about this anyway, but the beauty of the Jacaranda is it's still a lively place, not far from the student district of Liverpool, slap bang in the heart of a local district as well. It's that perfect crossover. And I remember introducing the lads on stage as a group of misfits who get together and play music on stage in a little club. And that's the magic of it, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, the rock and roll circus that we do on a Saturday night, which is sort of basically a ever-changing lineup of Liverpool musicians, and they're all professional recording musicians bringing out their own material. But they come together on a Saturday night. There might be, up to 25 different members, but the 5 of them will come together on a Saturday night and make some music. And they play big covers, and everyone dances around like they're hearing the original band play them at 1 a.m. And it's a really special sort of moment. But that was inspired by the fact that back in 1960, the bands were playing that late. But these days, bands don't play after 11 o'clock at night. And we just thought it might be really fun to take some inspiration from the history of the Jack and put a band on stage after midnight. And we sort of thought people might be a little bit into it, but it's taken on a life of its own. People love it. Yeah. And it culminated, of course, in us doing the big gig at St. George's Hall. And the day we were doing that show was the day that we found the John Lennon clip, and we had to rush around to get it in a state where we could use it, because it just seemed the perfect way to introduce that show at St. George's.
Honestly, this is something I've been discussing in this episode particularly, but also in episodes gone by. The amount of little chance encounters that happen and the small cogs that move to create this huge machine of the Beatles, the greatest band in history, but realistically, we're tracking the origin story of the Beatles. So far in the episodes gone by, I've went all the way from 1956, John Lennon being in school, setting up a little band called the Quarrymen, meeting Paul, meeting George. They play together, they record in Percy Phillips' studio in Kensington. And then eventually it could all crumble. They start getting gigs in the Casbah Coffee Club. Yeah. And then there's a huge moment in which they meet the owner of the Jacaranda, which wasn't you at that time. It was Allan Williams.
Although someone asked me that, an American tourist asked me that just a few months ago. They were in having a look around, and we'd shown them the basement. And I was with Oliver, who's one of the guys who works for us, and I said, "Oh, it was great meeting you," and walked off. And as I walked off, they turned to Oliver and they said, "Is that Allan Williams?" I thought, "Do I look like an Illuminati?" I mean, it's been a tough paper round, but I didn't think it was that bad. But yeah, what a moment for them, and they were hanging out in the Jack, I think, because it was where the musicians were hanging out and a lot of the kids from the art school, because Alan was putting these bands on the stage here, young bands, and they wanted to play here.
Yeah. So that's me. That Allan Williams, in essence, then becomes their manager. Well, he is the original manager of the Beatles. He gets them the audition with Larry Parnes, takes them to Scotland, and then when they come back from Scotland, and they've already played with different names, Long John Silver and the Beatles and Johnny and the Moondogs, they're going through different name changes already. Then it's the Silver Beatles, and that is the real Jacaranda era, isn't it?
Yeah,
the Silver Beatles, and they're here.
Yeah, I think, I am not a Beatles historian, so do not, quote me as fact, but my understanding is they did about 13 shows here around that time as the Silver Beatles.
Yeah.
And then when they come back from the Scotland tour, where Paul had been drumming, because I think their previous, Norman Chapman, previous drummer, had been called up for national service. He's a little bit older than them. They come back from Scotland, and Alan says, "I've got you a gig, guys. It's in Hamburg. The only snag is it's been booked as a 5-piece. So you're going to have to find a drummer."
Yeah.
And then they're looking around trying to find a drummer. And of course, there's the famous letter.
Well, this is what I was wanting to get to, and I want to ask you as well about how you started with the Jack. But let's go into this, because truthfully, this is one of the main reasons why I wanted to set up a podcast and talk about the origin story of the Beatles, because there's so many places in Liverpool that can legitimately call themselves the place where it all began.
Yeah.
Truthfully, I don't believe it matters. It's a marketing slogan, doesn't matter either way. I think where it begins is in Liverpool, and it's a group of working class lads who changed the world. But you guys got a beautiful plaque last August, it was, and I was here. Maypang was here.
Yeah.
John Lennon's sister Julia Baird. There was loads of great people here. Steve Holly, the drum of Wings, and they were all up here. And there was a plaque unveiled outside, and it's a great plaque. The story behind it is even better because it's actually quite a modern story about a guy finding a letter. You know.
Yeah.
So tell us about the letter.
So. It's nuts. So there's a car boot sale in Bootle, and a guy buys a second-hand book for 50p, takes it home and opens it up, and in the back is a letter from Paul McCartney to an unknown drummer. And then the letter reads something like, "Dear sir, we saw your advert in the Echo. Drummer looks for band. We'd like to offer you an audition in our band. Must be available for immediate departure to Hamburg. Please contact John or Paul or a member of The Beatles at the Jacaranda," and our phone number, like Royal 6544 or something, is in there from the time. And sign Paul McCartney and The Beatles. And I think this is one of the, if not the first, it's one of the very, very first times the word The Beatles, not the Silver Beatles, not Long John and the Silver Beatles, Johnny and the Beatles, but The Beatles is actually there. And so that's very interesting. I've always had a suspicion about that letter that it never got sent because it's found in the back of this book. And of course, this drummer was never auditioned because the very next day after the letter's written, they auditioned Pete Best. And I just, in my head, it's kind of like they're sat round in the Jacaranda and Allan says, "It's got to be a 5-piece. You need to find a drummer." And Paul's leafing through the Echo and sees this drummer looks for band. Brilliant. Pen and paper out, writes this letter. And then John says, "Hang on, Paul, what about Bestie?" And so they go over to the phone and phone up the Casbah and say, "Hey, Mo, can you put Pete on the phone? Pete, and Pete comes down and says, "John's on the phone for you." And there's "Hey, Pete, do you want to be in the band?" It's got to have been something like that because it's like a 24-hour period. So it happens very, very quickly. But they give Pete an audition, has an audition with the band and with Allan in the Worthen Club, which is the Blue Angel now, round the corner from here. And then the very next day, there's an all-day rehearsal with Pete, so he can learn the set for Hamburg in the basement here before the Jack opens. And so there they are, learning all of the songs. And again, I'm not a historian, but my understanding is Allan comes down and says, "We're going to open." And John says, "All right, we'll carry on playing. Don't worry about it." And so they carry on playing, people come in, and then for the first time, they're sort of playing in front of people with their new shortened name, The Beatles. Certainly there's some interviews with Pete Best where he talks about that as his first performance with the Beatles, and he describes some of the fans holding broomsticks with the microphones tied on the end because they didn't have mic stands. And Pete talks about that show and how the fans are holding these broomsticks. So it's a pretty cool moment, isn't it? And the very next day, of course, then they get up and they get in the van, they go off to Hamburg.
And that's also amazing because the van where they leave to go to Hamburg is outside on Slater Street, to my knowledge. I believe they pile in, and from Slater Street, outside the Jacaranda, off they go to Hamburg.
Yeah.
And from Hamburg, they become the Beatles. I was fortunate enough to go to Hamburg a few years ago.
Yeah.
I'd done a tour of Hamburg. I was fortunate as well. Stephanie Hempel, fantastic tour guide. She asked me while I was stood on the LIPA barn in Hamburg to start speaking all about the Merseybeat history and the cavern history. So there I was, speaking to a load of German people who couldn't understand the word I was saying, all about the Beatles history in the cavern. But the first time that we know they play an advertised gig is in the Indra Club.
Yes.
In Hamburg on the Reeperbahn. So that is where it happens.
That's like 2 days after the show here, I think. Yeah.
So that is a huge moment, and then they come back from Hamburg, and that's it. Then they are the Beatles.
Yeah.
It's very much solidified. But I love the fact that there's this crossover moment, and I also love the fact that in 2011, I think it's 2011, that this letter's discovered.
Yeah.
Someone ends up buying it at auction, because this is such a huge piece of history. Someone buys it at auction for ridiculous amounts of money, you know.
Yeah, it's like 50p to 35 grand.
It's crazy, isn't it?
Hell of a find at Cardiff, so.
No, honestly, the markup on that's brilliant, isn't it? But yeah, that for me is amazing, because we obsess about this story of the Beatles and every intricate detail. But that story you said just then about the fact that they probably never even sent the letter. This is a group of teenage lads hanging around a little club, making decisions that in 60 years' time, people are paying £35,000 for little letters they wrote.
So I know recently Barry Chan came in, who was the brother of Beryl Williams, Alan's wife. And we had quite a long conversation with Barry about this, because he went in the van with them over to Hamburg. And he was telling us he was actually had a job and was working, but he took a summer holiday break from work to go over. And they'd asked Barry to go because he was the only person they knew with a camera. And they wanted someone to take some photos. So he took his summer holiday, was going over to Hamburg with them. And we were talking to him about, what was it like, that moment, and you're getting in the van, and what do you remember about it? And he said, I don't remember anything about it, because they were rubbish. He said they couldn't play. They weren't very good. No one was paying attention. It was just another group of lads that Alan was, managing, and it didn't seem to be anything special about it. And we don't really remember anything about it because it was a nothing, and it's at Hamburg, I think, where they become musicians, and they really learn their craft.
When did it begin for you? When did your story of the Jacaranda begin?
So, a long time ago now. I think it was 2010. There's a bar group that the Jacaranda was part of the portfolio. And I got involved as a sort of operations manager for the bar group, looking after a bunch of bars, and the Jacaranda was one of them. Although my personal experience with the Jack goes back a lot longer. And I remember when Graham Clark, who owns the building, reopened it in, I think it was 1996. And I was just a bartender then, and leaning on the bar counter, just leafing through the Echo, wasting time. And saw this article about, guy opens Jacaranda, Beatles mural found. And I was kind of like, had my tongue in my cheek, sort of laughing a little bit, like, oh, here's someone else trying to trade off the Beatles. And as if he's found this mural, in the basement, not having any idea it become a really big part of my life. And then we used to drink in the Jack, in my late teens, early 20s. It wasn't my favourite bar. To be honest, it was kind of a bit too studenty, and it was a bit scruffy, and every single surface had a picture of the Beatles. I don't know if you remember it back then. But there was not an inch of the wall that didn't have a Beatles photo on it. And that wasn't, I love the Beatles, and I remember watching anthologies as a teenager and just becoming obsessed and riding to my teenage girlfriend's house, listening to the Beatles on cassette. So I love the Beatles, but no interest in kind of a Beatles bar at all. But my friends loved the open mic here, and they were like a duo. So they used to always say to me, where are we going? They said, we're going the Jack. I go, not again. So we spent a lot of time in here. It was really cool. I always enjoyed it when we came down. And that open mic's historic, and it's still going. We just did a session with Radio 1, recording artists at our open mic in preparation for the BBC's Big Weekender. So that'll be coming out on Radio 1 sometime over the summer. So it's a really iconic open mic. And then, years later, after all that, got involved as the operations manager of the company that was operating it. But after a couple of years, it became really apparent that although the other bars were making money, the Jacaranda actually, if you took it by itself, was losing quite a considerable amount of money every week. And although it had been popular, I think it had started to wane a little bit. And so we took the decision to close it while we had to think about what we were going to do with it. I think it was closed for about 18 months. And then we reopened it with a very specific mission. I think for a long time I wasn't sure how to approach it because I didn't want to run a Beatles bar, although a lot of respect for the history. The turning point for me was when I was sort of doing research on the Jacaranda and realised it wasn't the Beatles that played at the Jacaranda. It wasn't John, Paul, George and Ringo in the suits. It was actually just a bunch of lads who weren't very good at playing, having one of their first experiences, playing in front of an audience. Yeah. And I thought, that's really cool. That's what we should be doing with the Jack. We should be carrying on that legacy of helping bands get on stage for the first time, of having their first experiences playing in front of a live audience, and part of that process of developing bands. Because obviously the first band that was developed at the Jacaranda that became famous was the biggest band in the world. What a place for bands to start out and people to learn their craft on the same stage that John and Paul did. Yeah. So once I'd realised that, we were all guns blazing into reopening it. And actually it's been an amazing journey the last, 10 years since we reopened it. Well, that's 11 years this year.
Going back to what I said at the start, that clip of John speaking about the Jacaranda, but it was the fact that had been unearthed, it been discovered. There is incredible history in this little patch of land here on Slater Street. But what I think is the best thing about the Jacaranda, 100% what you said just then, you have many Beatle bars all around the city who trade simply off the back of the Beatles. It seems to be quite categorical that you guys don't. That the Beatles is almost a byproduct. It's a side note. And you 100% respecting the history of it, but you guys are so future looking. You're forward thinking, and I'm noticing most of the great things out of the city that are happening right now is coming from the Jacaranda in terms of music. I genuinely believe that. That's amazing. And the rock and roll circus on the Saturday nights is incredible.
So fun.
The stuff you guys are doing, great, but that very much is the plan. It's not necessarily looking back to the past, it's respecting the past, but what is the future for the Jacaranda?
Oh, that's a really good question, isn't it? I mean, we carry on selling records. I think one of the things we're really involved with at the moment is because we have the record shop, we do a lot of album launch shows for bands releasing albums. So that can be, from FKA Twigs and the Kaiser Chiefs down to people's first releases with Love Cat, the local artists we've supported a lot recently. Yeah. Crawlers had their first ever shows here, and they're an international level band now. Same with Stone. We know that Dave McCabe from the Zootons had some of his first experiences in front of a public at our open mic here. So I think we're carrying on developing those launch shows. And this year we've got shows happening as far afield as Cardiff, Carlisle, Birmingham, Chester, sort of, all over the country. So that's a privilege to take what we do and put it into other cities. But yeah, just keep trying to find amazing acts, which isn't hard in Liverpool. Yeah. And hopefully helping them platform up to bigger, greater things.
Fantastic. Graham, thank you very much.
Absolute pleasure.
Thanks for your time.
Thanks for having me.
Oh, thank you.
Brilliant.
So guys, that summarises becoming the Beatles. Personally, for me, as we get to the end of record this episode, this has been probably one of my favourite episodes to record and dig into the history of as well, because the history from this little period of time is really quite exciting, because the lads are becoming the Beatles. It's such an amazing story, and no matter how we view the intricate details of where it all began, it began in Liverpool. That's the origin story of these lads meeting each other, getting together, forming this band that goes on to become the best band in the world, the best band in history. What really made them a great band and took them to that next level is when they went to Hamburg in Germany. They were already the Beatles. I genuinely believe they were already the Beatles. Whether they performed as the Beatles, they had already come up with that name before they went to Hamburg. But when they went to Hamburg, they came back as a completely different band. It's undeniable. But the next episode, realistically, I should be recording in Hamburg. But this podcast, I'll be honest, it takes a lot of time, effort and energy and money to set it up. So if anybody wants to sponsor this podcast, if anyone wants to sponsor a nice little episode to Hamburg, get in touch. I'd love nothing more to go back to Hamburg. I have been before. It's a lovely place. But for now, let us know what you think about the episode. Let us know what you think. And the next episode, if it's not Hamburg, we go deeper into the history of the Beatles in Liverpool, to more of those specific little niche venues that people may not have visited before, that really started to shape the history of the band that changed the world. Make sure you like, subscribe. Thanks for watching. Thank you.